Between 1842 and 1844, when slavery was still a major factor in the Southern economy, Thomas Smallwood, a formerly enslaved person, partnered with much younger, staunch abolitionist Charles Torrey. Together, they worked to restore the rights of over 400 enslaved peoples by helping them escape their captors using what would become the earliest foundations of the Underground Railroad. What would prompt two men, one black, who purchased his own freedom, and one white, a Yale-educated graduate, to hold themselves responsible for this task in the often dangerous and sometimes deadly fray of the abolitionist movement. Thomas Smallwood was born February 22, 1801, in Prince George's County, which was a hotbed of tobacco plantations. Early on in life, his enslavers would take an unorthodox approach in caring for him, including teaching him how to read and write, which was legal under Maryland law. According to Smallwood in his biography, he soon became a walking curiosity in his village. His enslaver, Sarah Ferguson, was paid $500, now equivalent to $15,000, by her husband John to transfer ownership of Thomas Smallwood. At the age of 14, John had a legal document created stating he would either free Smallwood at 30 or allow him to pay off his $500 debt and be freed more quickly. Unfortunately for Smallwood, he wasn't able to raise the wages beforehand, but as promised, by age 30, he was set free. Soon after his newfound freedom, Smallwood would leave southern Maryland and head towards Washington, D.C., finding himself in a predominantly black neighborhood, working as a shoemaker near the Navy Yard and in proximity to what would soon become the White House. It was in this position, when he was known as Smallwood of the Yard, that he would hear the horrors of the slave trade, often involving the slave jail nearby, some telling of atrocities conducted against people he knew. Race relations grew even more tense after news of Nat Turner's uprising and angry white rioters were added to the list of an already favorable black population. As a reaction to these injustices, Smallwood joined the American Colonization Society, where he made several contacts, but this organization would prove to be another dishonest vehicle representing the institution of slavery, something he would later describe as being grievously deceived in his biography, as the organization amounted to a scheme that would ship newly freed people to Liberia, mainly because the enslavers funding the group were worried about freedmen uprising. It would ultimately be the pamphlet Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, written by David Walker, a pamphlet free blacks would be jailed for distributing, that would irreversibly set Smallwood on his aggressive abolitionist journey. By the end of the 1830s, Smallwood writes in his biography, he believed slavery was the most inhumane system that ever blackened the pages of history, and was more than ready to do something about it. Alternately, the man who would become Smallwood's sidekick, Charles Torrey, had a much more charmed upbringing to say the least. Having graduated from Yale and becoming first a school teacher and then a minister, Torrey, writing for the Massachusetts Abolitionist, also traded written barbs with another prominent abolitionist of the time, William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison, writing for the Liberator and subscribing to moral suasion, tried to persuade enslavers to free their slaves on moral grounds, whereas Torrey felt there needed to be a more hands-on approach. After trying his hand at both stumping for the Liberty Party, the abolitionist political party of the day, and taking the case of John Torrance, a recaptured enslaved person, and losing, Torrey refused to be defeated and headed to Washington. It was inevitable that by 1842, Torrey had managed to land himself in an Annapolis jail cell. It was in this jail cell, shared with two other black families, that Torrey would hear the story of a retracted freedom. The owner of the 13 incarcerated, John D. Hutton, had died, and upon his death, had freed these 13 individuals. The only issue was that Hutton died in debt, and his creditors were trying to acquire these newly freed people to sell off and recoup their debt. Torrey had already become a budding abolitionist prior to this incident, so hearing this was a heartbreaking tale of these retracted rights was enough of a catalyst to change what he ultimately felt responsible for in his life. As it was, Torrey's incarceration was a result of infiltrating a slaveholders' meeting under false pretenses, when in actuality, he wanted to report on it for the anti-slavery newspaper, The Emancipator, where he would go on to describe slavery as a system of diabolical proportions. After hearing his cellmate's harrowing tale, however, he also included a vow to return to that cell in a decade to celebrate the abolition of slavery. He just didn't know at the time how large of a role he was about to play. By 1842, both Smallwood and Torrey would be in Washington. Smallwood, having read about Torrey's exploits in the name of abolition, took a liking to the man who was lambasted in the Baltimore Sun and Cecil Whig, the latter calling him a northern fanatic. Smallwood and Torrey would also share a more intimate association through Smallwood's wife, Elizabeth, who did laundry at the boarding house Torrey was staying at and who would ultimately set up their initial meeting on Smallwood's request. Their like-mindedness, coupled with the vast and complementary skill sets, would prove to be their most valuable commodity in helping restore the rights of enslaved peoples. Smallwood could exist in spaces around town that Torrey would seem out of place if not downright conspicuous in, such as simply conversing with other black folks on the street. As a cobbler, it was part of Smallwood's business to converse daily and visit with clients, so his about-time demeanor would not raise an eyebrow. Conversely, Torrey was a learned man with many connections who had large pockets, connections to people who were equally against the slave trade but were unwilling to take on the dangerous physical responsibility that Torrey and Smallwood agreed to. It would be a speech given by one of Torrey's early allies, Garrett Smith, entitled An Address to the Slaves of the United States of America, that would really show how the abolitionist movement would move forwards. He stated that no longer should the focus be on chastising the enslavers, but convincing the enslaved to run away from slavery, which was effective and would ultimately result in the escape of 1,000 enslaved people a year, a number that Smallwood and Torrey would soon help add to. Since moral rebukes were not an effective tool against enslavers, the idea was to hit them in their pocketbook. How many enslaved people could escape from their homes and plantations before the enslavers gave up trying to replace them? This was a hypothesis Torrey and Smallwood could not wait to test. It was during the first meeting between the two men that Torrey would, as Smallwood later stated, inform me of a scheme he had in view and requested my assistance. That scheme would be to relieve Secretary of the Navy and former North Carolinian George Edmund Badger of the entirety of his enslaved household staff. The risk was great, a 6-year sentence for any man caught aiding in the escape of the enslaved, but more than likely death, as the private hired guns of the wealthy would have their property hunted down and found, and with all likelihood, killing whoever was in possession of them at the time. Smallwood additionally faced the prospect of being sold back into slavery due to the heavy fines incurred, fines he could never pay off in multiple lifetimes. But just as the escape plan was reaching its pinnacle, Waller Freeman, the father of the enslaved family, paid Badger $1,500 to free them. Disappointed the money went into the slavers' pockets, Smallwood and Torrey would not be deterred, amplifying their efforts and setting their sights on a problematic port city to the northeast, Baltimore. There was no shortage of disreputable and dangerous degenerates posing as businessmen in the Baltimore harbor, and none more despicable than Hope Slater,
owner of a wildly profitable slave jail in Pratt Street. Fells Point and the surrounding area
were home to hundreds of both free and enslaved people, though that determination mattered not to those trying to make a quick buck from the flesh of freed men. A fictionalized composite of these abductions can be found in Ya Gisai's narrative, Homegoing, where one of the characters, Anna, who is pregnant, is at 1 minute shopping in the market for her family, and the next is forcibly placed in a carriage and carted away, her family not finding out until days later, and she would never be seen again. It was of growing concern that free men and women would be abducted from Fells Point and sold back into slavery, and Slater's insistence of moving the enslaved from his jail onto ships in the dead of night reinforced an image of deception and corruption. But Smallwood and Torrey would not be deceived. Drawing inspiration from Charles Dickens under the pen name Sam Weller Jr., Smallwood began writing what would be known as the laughingstock letters for an abolitionist paper Torrey was editing.
Token of Liberty.
These letters would taunt and tease men like Slater and put more of a target on both Smallwood and Torrey's backs as the Baltimore
escapes
would begin to get underway and ultimately intensify. It would also lead to infighting with the likes of Frederick Douglass, who did not want to draw more attention to these escapes. The first of these escapes would happen a stone throw from Slater's jail at the Gilmore residence. Robert Gilmore would awake to find his 5 enslaved house staff missing in a week's time, once his newly freed had escaped to Ontario, mocked for having them in his possession in the first place. Soon after, John Douglas, worried he would be sold away from his family, joined a caravan of 8 people and headed to Ontario. The escapes, dramatized stories, and unrelenting mockery of the slavers continued for many years with an ever-growing network of loyal compatriots. Responding to wanted ads for escaped enslaved individuals, Smallwood instructed the slavers to apply at the office of the Underground Railroad. Operating 20 years before Harriet Tubman, if she was the Moses of the Underground Railroad, Smallwood was certainly its Abraham, guiding 400 newly freed men, women, and children north to Ontario before he himself, with an incalculable number of bounties on his head, decided to stay in Canada. Smallwood lived to the ripe old age of 82, dying of natural causes in 1883. Unfortunately, Torrey would not be as lucky as Smallwood to escape. Slater's unrelenting campaign to link these men to the escapes that had had dire consequences, and Torrey was eventually arrested and convicted for his assistance in helping to free Hannah Gooseberry and her children from William Heckerett. After 20 minutes of deliberation, Torrey was sentenced to 6 years for aiding and abetting. While serving his sentence in the Maryland Penitentiary, he would contract tuberculosis and die on May 9, 1846, a day before his pardon reached the prison walls. Torrey would be immortalized in the Underground Railroad movement and act as a martyr for the cause that led him to give up his rights for the rights of others and to ultimately give up his life for the responsibility of freeing enslaved peoples.